This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. As Asian economies increasingly rise in prominence and productivity, the home of more than half the world's population becomes an increasing part of our discussion in the West. Two journalists in this week's episode offer varying looks at some of the more prominent countries in the region. First, Tracy Dahlby spent decades going in and out of Japan, China, Vietnam, and more. Reflecting on his reporting for National Geographic and other publications, he discusses his book, Into the Field, a foreign correspondent's notebook. And then, one country that stands as a major outlier in the region for seeing no rise in prosperity at all is North Korea. Former Washington Post correspondent Blaine Harden examines the country as a study in contrast in The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot, the true story of the tyrant who created North Korea and the young lieutenant who stole his way to freedom. But first, here's my interview with Tracy Dahlby. You saw over several decades an opportunity where certain Asian countries were going through change, but also how America was constantly changing in its relationship as you were an American exploring these areas. And one of those questions you keep bumping up against is this constant reminder by people in these countries that you can't possibly understand what it's like to be here. You can't possibly understand what it's like to be in real Japan, real Vietnam, and so on and so forth, because you've got your American mindset. How do you bridge that divide?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think you're always, as a foreign correspondent, pushing your way through that door marked no entry. And, once you get inside the other culture, you really need to develop some tools for trying to get farther into the story. I mean, I really, this book is kind of a love letter to the craft of long-distance reporting, but it's also a plea for, the survival, the maintenance of immersive reporting.
And we see today a lot of journalism, or a lot of what's called explainer journalism, of people kind of trying to have immediate takes, immediate opinions about anything from, Cy Hirsch's story about the bin Laden capture to whatever Vladimir Putin is doing, to any of the noise we're hearing out of North Korea or China or what have you. And a lot of the people writing this are people who are desk-bound, who are young, and don't have specific experience in the field, but the idea being that they can somehow gather these facts with the internet and with all the information that's available.
I call it digital gotcha. The speed bump that young people have today particularly is, we're flooded by information, and it splits our focus, and the danger is that it makes us think we understand things when we don't. In my generation, it was completely opposite. It was the economy of scarcity. We didn't know nothing about nothing, although we might have kind of a dream and a fairy tale to explore the world, but we were really, it was hard to find information. Now we have exactly the opposite problem. So I think the danger is that you start lining up those facts, but without the deeper context, without an understanding of history, without an understanding of kind of the, not to put it too large, but the human condition, it's very difficult to get that formula right.
You're writing about being a National Geographic correspondent, tackling XYZ issue for weeks, months at a time, going somewhere, immersing yourself, running up a huge expense.
Yeah, those were the good old days.
And writing for a magazine that, it's astonishing again to think of this number that you write about. They had 9 million subscribers at the time. It's just almost impossible for someone in my generation to imagine that kind of investment in reporting. When you look around now, what kind of investment do you see being made?
Somebody asked me, I was speaking with a group last night, and they asked me, is there any good journalism around? And I said, well, there's tons of good journalism around. The problem is that we need to be much more selective. Start with some good staple food like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And they said, well, why the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal? Well, because, if you look at digital startups, if you look at TV still, where do a lot of those stories come from? They come from the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, because these large institutions have the resources and have the wherewithal to really report stories, to report a broad menu of stories and to get to the bottom of them. I think you really need to kind of eat good food in order to to have, to be a good journalist and to come up with good story ideas.
And now, the great leader and the fighter pilot with Blaine Harden. We have a lot of ideas about what North Korea is that are fed primarily by popular media. But when you dig more deeply into the story of how it is that way, why it is that way, you end up with a very different impression.
It's true. North Korea was created by the United States in 1945. A couple of colonels in the White House drew a line across the Korean Peninsula, designated the North and the South, and the Soviet Union took the North, and the Americans took the South, and then they each found puppets to run those places. The Soviets picked Kim Il-sung, who was an anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter who was well known. His name was well known to the Korean people. They hated the Japanese who'd ruled the peninsula for 50 years, very, very roughly. And he turned out to be much more than a puppet, though.
Right, and in a way, it reflects success, a horrible, horrible success.
The Kim family has been outstanding in its success as a dictatorship. Most regimes like this, in fact, all of them, collapse after the death of the first big man. Hitler died, Nazi Germany was finished. Stalin died, the Gulag melted away in 3 or 4 years. Mao died, and China substantially changed. Kim Il-sung died in 1994. It's now 2015, and really nothing has changed. And it's because the son and the grandson have lost none of their capacity for cruelty to their own people that the great leader had.
Throughout the book, you have this story of the fighter pilot, who's kind of the foil or the counterpart.
Right.
Tell us about this guy, No Kum-sung.
What I wanted to do in this book is explain why North Korea behaves in ways that Americans often perceive as nutty. I wanted to make this an exciting read, an adventure story with real tension. And so as the book begins, there's a young man whose father's died, and his father had been a baseball player, a pro-American businessman, and he had instilled in his son a desire to get out of a communist state and go to the United States. So at the beginning of the book, the young man has no way of doing that. He doesn't know what to do. And suddenly he decides that his way out is to become an actor. So he pretends to love his great leader. He pretends to be a #1 communist. He joins the Naval Academy. He becomes the youngest fighter pilot in the North Korean Air Force. He becomes a fighter pilot flying MiGs, trained by the Russians. Secretly, Stalin sent his best pilots to Manchuria and trained him to fly the MiG-15. And all of a sudden, he's up in the air flying this MiG against American Sabre jets. So he basically danced around in the air for 2 years, managing not to kill anybody and not to get killed. And then finally, 7 weeks after the war was over, he was allowed to go up on a routine combat readiness mission without anybody else with him. After 6 years of planning, he made a 17-minute flight to South Korea and landed and said, basically, take me to your leader, and you can have this MiG if you'd like it.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish Channel is available on cable: Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, Iowa Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.